It began as a night like so many before, filled with laughter, booze, and the easy bond of long-time friendship. Three men, bound by over a decade of shared memories, met once again to unwind. David Eaton, Matthew Higgins, and Wayne Webb had made these nights a ritual. For them, gathering over drinks wasn't an event, it was tradition. Familiar. Safe. But this night would be anything but. As the hours wore on and the alcohol flowed, a harmless prank set the tone. One of the friends awoke to find his eyebrow shaved off. For the others, it was just a drunken joke, foolish but funny. But for him, it was a line crossed. An insult. A humiliation too raw to laugh off. What followed was a sudden shift, from tipsy laughter to rising tension. Tempers flared. Words were exchanged. And then, in a moment soaked in rage and liquor, it happened. A kitchen knife was grabbed. A heart was stabbed. Not once, but twice. What started as a night of camaraderie ended in bloodshed. Earlier that evening, everything seemed normal. David, Matthew, and Wayne had done what they always did, drink, joke, and let loose. David and Matthew, in particular, shared a deep connection, not only as friends but as partners in trouble. Both were known in the village for their drinking problems and frequent brushes with the law. After hours of bar hopping and heavy drinking, they made their way to Matthew's home to continue the party. None of them knew that by morning, one of them would be dead, and the others changed forever. As the night deepened, the alcohol began to take its toll. David eventually passed out on Matthew's sofa, his body limp from exhaustion and booze. But Matthew and Wayne were still wide awake, tipsy, restless, and looking for laughs. That's when the idea struck. The two men, still chuckling from earlier jokes, glanced at their unconscious friend. "Let's shave his eyebrow," one of them said, barely suppressing laughter. It wasn't out of cruelty. At least, not in their minds. For them, this was just another drunken prank. A harmless tradition. In fact, a video Wayne had posted months earlier showed him firing a toy crossbow at a sleeping friend. Mischief was their language. And tonight, David was the target. So they shaved off his eyebrow. They laughed. They moved on. But the next morning, things changed. David woke up groggy and disoriented, and quickly realized something was wrong. His face. His eyebrow. Gone. And no one was laughing now. Wayne had already left by the time David confronted Matthew. Tension exploded instantly. Enraged and embarrassed, David punched Matthew without warning. Matthew fell to the floor under a flurry of kicks. The fight was one-sided. David had the upper hand, both physically and emotionally. Desperate to calm things down, Matthew blurted out, "It wasn't me, it was Wayne." That single sentence shifted everything. David believed him. The tension fizzled for the moment, and they both moved on as if nothing had happened. But the peace was short-lived. Later that day, a second argument erupted, this time in public. The two were seen yelling, fists raised, tempers flaring once again. Eventually, they went their separate ways. Matthew returned home. David went to his girlfriend Emma's house, but he was still fuming. He couldn't let it go. Fueled by anger and shame, David decided to confront Wayne directly. He stormed over to Wayne's place and demanded answers. "Did you do it?" But Wayne denied everything, swearing on his mother's life that he had nothing to do with the prank. That's when the realization hit David like a hammer, it had been Matthew all along. Without hesitation, David and Emma turned around and headed straight back to Matthew's house. David wasn't coming to talk this time. He was coming for revenge. Matthew opened the door, and within seconds, David's fist slammed into his face. Another scuffle broke out. Shouts, pushing, chaos. But this time, Matthew snapped. "I'm not putting up with this," he growled, turning toward the kitchen. David followed, still raging. But before he could say another word, Matthew reached the counter, grabbed a knife from the block, and turned around. What happened next was brutal. Sudden. With no hesitation, Matthew plunged the blade into David. Once. Twice. Straight into his chest, piercing his heart both times. David stumbled back, clutching his chest, his voice raw with panic. Knife. You've actually stabbed me. Emma. He stabbed me. Blood soaked through his shirt as he collapsed to the floor. Emma stood frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Matthew, his hands dripping with blood, ran out the front door and into the street. Seeing a neighbor nearby, he shouted breathlessly, "Best ring an ambulance, I just stabbed my mate. He was doing my head in." Panic spread fast. Sirens echoed in the distance as emergency calls flooded in. "Someone's been stabbed," one neighbor told dispatch. "There's screaming. I think he's still inside." Within 5 minutes, police, paramedics, and even an air ambulance were on the scene. Rapid response officers were the first to enter the house. They found Matthew Higgins bent over David's body, desperately trying to give first aid. But the blood was everywhere. Confirmed stab wound to the chest. Heavy bleed, an officer reported. "We need to move him away from the door." "Is he breathing?" someone asked. "I don't know." Paramedics quickly took over. Matthew stepped aside, trembling. Moments later, an officer approached him. "Marty, come here." "What's happened?" "Come here a sec." Matthew turned toward them silently. "At the moment, you're under arrest, until we figure out what's going on," the officer said calmly. "You're under arrest on suspicion of grievous bodily harm." Matthew didn't resist. "Is there anyone else in the house?" another officer asked. "No," he replied. "He fell on a knife." But no one believed that. "Yes, suspect secured," an officer reported over the radio. "I need a defib and a bleed kit, now." Moments passed like hours. "What's the drill, mate?" another officer asked calmly. "It's 16:04. "Okay. Matthew Higgins, you are now further under arrest for murder." The officer's voice shifted to a formal tone. "You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you understand?" Matthew nodded slightly, confused and shaken. "Yeah. I understand." "Is he dead?" The officer didn't answer directly. "So, murder. So he's dead. Yes or no?" "I can't go into that right now," the officer replied, "but at this moment, you are under arrest for murder." Matthew mumbled, "All right. Sweet. He fell on a knife. I'm not proud of it." What followed inside the holding cell was chaos. While in custody, Matthew Higgins snapped. Without warning, he lunged forward and headbutted an officer, a violent outburst that required multiple officers to restrain him. When the time came for questioning, he stuck to his story. He fell on the knife, he repeated again and again. But that claim was unraveling fast. Several witnesses had already told police what they heard, Matthew shouting in the street, panicked and bloody, yelling that he had stabbed his friend. His confession had echoed down the street. The truth soon followed. Eventually, Matthew admitted that it hadn't been a tragic accident. He had stabbed David, but still claimed it was in self-defense. That he was afraid. That he hadn't meant for it to go that far. Meanwhile, David's girlfriend, Emma Deed, was brought in for questioning. She described everything, how David had returned, furious, to confront Matthew. The argument. The punches. And then, the moment the two disappeared into the house. A scream cut through the silence. David's voice. Full of pain and panic, crying out her name. "Emma! He stabbed me!" And by the time she ran in, it was already too late. Emma pleaded with Matthew, begging him to drop the knife. But he wouldn't listen. With fury still burning in his eyes, he vowed, "He'll never lay hands on me again." In that moment, David, wounded and bleeding, uttered one final word, soft, broken, and filled with regret, "Sorry." Then he collapsed to the floor, never to rise again. Emma was later questioned by police but released without charge. She had witnessed a tragedy she could never erase. Matthew Higgins, however, faced the full weight of the law. Charged with murder and the assault of an emergency responder, he stood before the court maintaining his innocence. He claimed it had been self-defense, a desperate response to a violent friend. But the evidence said otherwise. The jury found him guilty of murder. He did plead guilty to the charge of assaulting a police officer. And the judge, unmoved by his explanations, sentenced Matthew to life in prison, with a minimum of 18 years behind bars before he'd even be considered for release. A night that began with laughter and drinks between old friends had ended in irreversible tragedy. A drunken prank, meant to be nothing more than a joke, became the spark that lit a fire of violence, betrayal, and death. David Eaton, just 37 years old, lost his life over a shaved eyebrow. And Matthew Higgins, once a close friend, crossed a line that can never be uncrossed, turning into a killer in one explosive moment of rage. For David's children, for his loved ones, for everyone who knew him, the loss is a wound that will never fully heal. This haunting story serves as a sobering reminder of how fast things can unravel when alcohol, tempers, and poor choices collide. And how one moment, one terrible, impulsive moment, can destroy everything. What happened that night wasn't just a murder. It was a chain reaction, one fueled by ego, alcohol, and unchecked emotion. A prank that should have ended in laughter ended in blood. And all it took was a single moment, a single spark of rage, to change everything forever. David Eaton didn't die in some gang war or planned attack. He died in his friend's kitchen, at the hands of someone he trusted. That's what makes this story truly terrifying. It reminds us that danger doesn't always come from strangers in the dark. Sometimes, it's sitting next to you on the couch, laughing with a beer in hand. Friendship is fragile. And when mixed with alcohol, pride, and unresolved anger, it can snap. In today's world, we brush off red flags. We call it just banter, or he was just drunk, or boys being boys. But this story shows what happens when those moments are ignored. When jokes go too far. When tempers are left unchecked. 1 second, you're laughing. The next, someone's gone. Matthew Higgins claimed he acted in self-defense. Maybe he believed that. But does it matter when someone ends up dead? The truth is, once that knife was picked up, it didn't matter who threw the first punch. It didn't matter who shaved the eyebrow or who started the fight. What mattered is who ended it, and how. For David's children, his family, and his girlfriend Emma, that night didn't just take away a person. It took away their future. Their peace. Their sense of safety. And for Matthew, one foolish act ended his freedom, his friendships, and the life he once knew. So let this story be more than just content. Let it be a reminder that anger is dangerous. That pride can be deadly. That when we act on impulse, we don't just risk our own lives, we risk the lives of everyone around us. If there's one thing to take away from this, it's simple: think before you act. Control your emotions. Because 1 second of violence can destroy a lifetime of love.